is a little film that I hope will perhaps draw some of the points out of the Norway film I hope you've just seen, and then allow you to get on with having a discussion about the points that arise without me being in the room. These are 5 of the big questions that keep being raised by people in the events that have happened so far: Perth, Dundee, Glasgow and Falkland in Fife. Perhaps the top question is one about tax, because everybody knows Norway is a high tax economy. Everybody knows how much it costs to have a pint of beer in Norway, and for some reason in Scotland the price of a pint of beer could be said to lead our thinking about the whole of democracy. Trying to set aside for 1 minute just how kind of poor that is really as a marker of anything, it's obviously saying that Norway feels expensive, and it feels like that's not our kind of society. And you know, at the moment that's absolutely right. First thing to say, for the Norwegians a pint of beer is not that expensive. They have a high wage, high cost economy, so that for them it's actually not quite as eye-watering as it is for us coming into it. The next thing to say is our tax levels here in Britain are unbelievably low. We've been like boiled frogs since Thatcher, in that we've slowly adapted to changes about taxation so that really what we pay now seems to be to us normal, whereas actually across most of Europe it's really low. There's very unfair aspects to our taxation. Something like VAT is about as unfair as you get, because it's a flat rate tax, so poor folk pay it the same as rich folk. And our VAT is 20%, which is higher than many other countries. So if you want tax, if you want excellent services, and this is the next bit, then you must have high tax. Services, let's talk about that. In Norway, it's illegal to make profit from education. And that means that the education service is fantastic, because all the officials, the politicians, the professionals, all the kind of high-class folk, although they don't really recognise class, all those folk are in the public system. So that increases solidarity, and it means that their services are fantastic. That's why you pay tax. If you live in Sweden, you have the world's best old folks care. You wouldn't dream of going out with your council run home. Your only hope is you manage to stay in and get there when you grow old. That's how good state provision is. That's what your taxes are for. If you have children, and begorra, if we didn't have children, there would be no tomorrow. If you have children in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, in any of these countries, you're getting the best quality kindergarten care, not for 1 or 2 years or for part-time or just during the term times and not at holidays. No, you're getting it from when the children are 1 until they're 6 or 7, which is when they go to school, not 4 or 5. So for all of that, with a small contribution that works out at about 200 quid a month maximum, for all of that in your taxes, you get all those things taken care of. Do you think if you could be certain you would never need to buy private healthcare, education, insurance to make sure that you're protected against the bad standards of care generally in Britain? Do you think if that was all bought for you by your taxes, do you think you might give a few bob more in your taxes too? Because I think you probably would. And there's a final point: trust. The levels of trust in the Nordics are the highest in the world. That's trust between citizens and their government, and citizens and citizens. And this really matters, because people know that if they pay their tax dollar, or their tax kroner we should say, they will get these services. They won't have their money spent on vanity projects, on political dogma, on Trident, on systems like universal credit, which are killing people right now in Britain. That does not happen, even when there are conservative governments running their countries. So you trust enough to pay taxes because you don't think it's going to go to unsavoury ends. In Britain, you couldn't be sure of that. But in Scotland, we have the highest trust levels in the UK. So we're beginning to pull away from a British model, which is based on quite correct levels, high levels of citizen mistrust of government. And whilst that mistrust exists, you cannot effectively have a proper society. and you will not pay the taxes necessary to have cohesion, decent systems, and to eliminate poverty. So beer, taxes, it's just the start of a far better way of running a life. The second question that people ask a lot is about diversity within Norway. They see that it's a very white society. To be honest, Scotland within the UK is pretty white as well. But of course, there was the terrible incident with Anders Breivik, who killed 72 people some years ago. And all the Nordic countries have got far-right parties which are gaining in popularity in voting. So the things to say about that, well, the first thing is that none of the Nordics had empires. And that means they didn't have colonies, it means they didn't have a commonwealth, and they haven't had the situation Britain's had of a relationship with countries very far across the world and a regular input of those people over the last century. So people arriving in the last wee while in the Nordic countries have been a bit of a shock to the system. The way that they've managed to progress so well is partly because they're very homogeneous, similar kind of societies, where everyone roughly thinks the same thing. Everyone is Lutheran. There's very few deviations of any great size. So actually trying to accommodate difference, I think, has been a big problem for them. People arriving in Norway and Sweden do not speak Norwegian and Swedish, refugees. They do tend to speak English when they arrive in Britain, and they're very often joining communities that have been established for a very long time. That's not true in the Nordics, so it's been more difficult to integrate. Perhaps the biggest problem for the likes of Sweden has been the very high standards they've got for anyone to have any kind of job. Even a manual job needs qualifications. You don't get qualifications unless you speak very good Swedish, and you don't speak very good Swedish if you arrive as a teenage refugee at the age of 11, which is the average refugee. They know they've got a problem and they're trying to fix it, but it'll take some time. Norway, well, some people have said to me the problem for Norwegians is that they are intolerant of the intolerant. By that, they mean that if you take certain societies and ethnic groups who don't rate human rights very highly, who don't rate women's rights very highly, they have almost no time for them. So that has a difficulty because there are now large Muslim populations who have not been integrated very well. So yes, there's a bit of an issue there, but they come from a very, very different place to Britain that has had integration because of our colonising efforts over the last century and more. Third question, and this is a toughie, can we have an oil fund as an independent Scotland? You'll have seen the very thorough explanation that Eirik Wærness gave there from Equinor, the successor organisation really to Statoil that managed all the oil exploration for Norway. And what he says really is echoed by a lot of people, that basically our oil fields are now reaching maturity, that the world demands that we move very quickly from a fossil fuel type economy to a renewables green powered economy. And that renewables industry will be massive, but it will never produce quite the same extraordinary profits and therefore the same capacity to draw incredible amounts of tax out of it that the Norwegians had. And there's no two ways about it. Margaret Thatcher wasted our opportunity, but here we are now. Perhaps the other important thing to say is that renewables will give massive jobs for us. It will give us a lead in technology, which we already have. It will allow us to keep population all over Scotland the same way that Norway's been doing since hydro, because renewables are located in remote areas as well as central ones. And perhaps the biggest thing it does for us is to stabilise our economy on something that is not quite as volatile as the oil price, because we'll be using the heating and the energy ourselves. That's one thought. The other question about that oil fund, Norway became an independent country long before it discovered oil. It became independent in 1905 to become Europe's second poorest nation. They didn't become independent to exploit oil, but they were well set up, well organised amongst themselves to jump on that advantage when it came their way. The question for Scotland is, are we well set up enough to absolutely grab the opportunities of renewables and run with it? The fourth question people have asked is about this question of whether Scotland would be better as a full member of Europe or, like Norway, a member of the halfway house, the EEA. Forgive me if I've explained this before, but here we go. Back in the 70s, there were two European trade blocs around. One was the group to become the EU. The other was EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. Now, EFTA didn't want integration. They didn't want fancy institutions. They didn't want to create a currency. They just wanted trade. It was, if you like, the bargain basement option. Britain used to be a member of EFTA, lots of people did, but as the EU began to, well, the EC began to become the EU and amassing more powers with more ambition, with structures, with institutions, that attracted lots of members over, including Britain, who felt the EU was the meatier kind of bloc to be part of. But EFTA still remained. It's got 4 members: Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Switzerland. They're tiny. That's why they don't want Britain in there. And just recently, we're talking now at the beginning of November, the Norwegian Prime Minister, who is a Conservative, told Theresa May on a visit to Oslo with no equivocation whatsoever, we dinna want Britain in because you're too big and you'd wreck our organisation. So, Scotland, different question. Absolutely the right size for being in the halfway house. Would it do anything for us? Well, maybe's aye, maybe's no. What Norway gets out of it, as Oyvind explained, is that it manages to not have its political sovereignty taken from it to quite the same degree. Now that's kind of questionable because every regulation the EU passes has to be observed by Norway whether they like it or not. And actually, Norway observes more EU regulations than Sweden, and Sweden is an EU member. So maybe there's a thing about the illusion of control which was important for Norwegians, and maybe it's not so important for us having been EU members. The Common Fisheries Policy is a big thing. Norway and particularly Iceland have economies that are very dependent on fish. So the Common Fisheries Policy that allows access by boats of every other country wasn't going to happen for Iceland, and pretty well wasn't going to happen for Norway either. Because they rate their remote areas and their fishing interests. Now, Scotland, well, I think we could do with a period out of the Common Fisheries Policy and trying to align our industry with the far more fair, equitable and better conserved way of running things that the Norwegians have. So that might happen anyway, because we will probably be drawn out of the EU by Brexit unless Brexit is halted. If that happens, then there might be a transitional re-entry for an independent Scotland, and the halfway house might be the first resting place. And who knows, because nobody knows about this future, it hasn't been done, that might be a resting place that we choose to stay in for a longer time than a shorter one. The last one is land reform, and actually this really has been the most frequently asked question, and it might be because people know it's something that's very dear to my heart. I hope that it's because, particularly in the Norway film, it's so crystal clear what a huge impact the ownership of land has had on the development of Norway. Why, people ask, are we taking so long to get on with it here? And I wish I had an answer. Of course, some of the big ways of dealing with land ownership issues are reserved, some of those taxation powers, but the bulk of them aren't. We could be doing stuff that the Norwegians have already done, and the Danes. There you have a situation where you can't buy productive land, that's farming land, the likes of what we're sitting in around here. You can't buy that unless you've done 5 years at agricultural college. That's why the second biggest private landowner in Scotland is now a Dane, Anders Poulsen, because he wouldn't be able to buy a square inch of what he's able to buy here with no questions asked in his own country. He also currently pays no tax on it, unlike any other place really within the Nordics. We could have done that. We could also have a tenant's farmer's right to buy. The Irish had that in 1903. It changed their country. And if the First World War hadn't intervened, that same device would have been extended to Scotland. It didn't happen. It still hasn't happened, but it would mean about 5,000 tenant farmers were able to buy their farms overnight. And you know, in terms of private owners of land, that would, gosh, I'd need to do the maths, but I think it would increase it by tenfold, that one decision. And there's other things that are slowly beginning to happen. There are community buyouts, but here's the thing. Much as community buyouts are great, and you may know I spent 8 years as a trustee of the Isle of Egg Trust, and it was life-changing. The point is that in Norway there are no community buyouts because there are fair land laws. There are hundreds of thousands of landowners, so one guy doesn't get to decide absolutely everything, as is still the case in Scotland. Now, just not to beat ourselves up, the Norwegians never had feudal land ownership, and that has been the nightmare for us. But we still haven't weeded it properly out of our system. And I hope this should raise questions in your mind about how we managed to persuade a governing party that we absolutely must have a greater diversity of who owns land before we do more rollout of forestry and more rollout of wind turbines, both of which are putting millions into the pockets of people who have been feudal landowners for far too long.